Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event featuring author and Pulitzer Prize finalist Laila Lalami and her book, Conditional Citizens. We are honored to partner with the University of Washington Departments of English and of Comparative History of Ideas on this, and Laila will be joined in conversation by Dr. Anu Taranath, teaching professor in those departments. We would also like to thank Amy Goodlow and UW Alumni Association for all their support for this event. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer at University Bookstore in Seattle. Let us know where you're zooming in from in the chat, because we would love to see where everyone is, since these Zoom events bring us closer in a way that normal events don't. With me behind the scenes is Miyako, one of our event coordinators. We would both like to thank you all for spending this evening with us and the company of two phenomenal authors. Conditional Citizens is a brilliantly argued and deeply personal work in which Pulitzer Prize finalist Laila Lalami recounts her unlikely journey from Moroccan immigrant to U.S. citizen, using her own story as a starting point for an exploration of the rights, liberties, and protections that are traditionally associated with American citizenship. Laila was born in Rabat and educated in Morocco, Great Britain, and the United States. She's the author of 4 novels, including The Moor's Account, which won the American Book Award, the Arab American Book Award, and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her book, The Other Americans, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her essays have appeared in the LA Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Harper's Magazine, The Guardian, and the New York Times. Laila is a professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, and lives in Los Angeles. Dr. Anu Taranath brings both passion and expertise to her work as a speaker, facilitator, author, and educator. A University of Washington professor for the past 20 years, she teaches about race, gender, equity, and global literatures. As a DEI and racial equity consultant, she offers coaching, training, facilitation, and other types of partnerships. Her book, Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World, was selected as winner of the Newsweek Future of Travel Awards in Storytelling, a finalist for 4 book awards, including the Washington State Book Award, and to name Fodor's Travels 13 books to inspire your travels, and Oprah Magazine's best 26 travel books of all times. Dr. Anu and her book have been profiled in Newsweek, Mindful, and National Geographic magazines, to name a few. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions for the authors, please add them to the Q&A field at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and we'll get to them at the end. And now I will turn over the virtual stage to Laila and Anu.
Thank you, Grace. Good evening, everyone, or perhaps it is morning when you are watching this on video a few days later. I'm so delighted to be in conversation today with Laila. Thanks so much, University Bookstore and UW Alumni Association, for inviting me into this space today. Hi there, Laila. How's it going?
Hi, how are you, Anu?
It's going okay. I've been really immersed in your words the last few days. A friend of mine gave me your book, Hope and Other Pursuits, I would say maybe a decade ago. Oh, and wow. That was my first introduction to you. And since then, I've been following your work from afar, admiring the reach of it, but also its accessibility. You speak about really complex matters of state, of politics, of law, and of policies, but you do it in a way that humanizes each other in unforgettable ways. There are so many ways to write about some of these topics, right? Why do you write about things the way you do?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And thank you for asking that, because not very many people inquire about it from that particular lens. I think if I had to guess at the sort of approach that I use, I think it has something to do with the way that I grew up. You know, I'm Right now, I'm a professor at the University of California. It's an R1 institution. You know, it's published obviously many books. I write for all these magazines. So from the outside, it would look like this is a very, how shall I say, it's a very academic, very elite, very privileged sort of platform that I have. But then on the other hand, when I look at how I grew up, I came from a working class family. My parents didn't go to college. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was illiterate, didn't know how to read or write. And so, you know, all my life I've had, when I've been asked, what is it that you do, you know, at school, like if I've been asked by my parents or if I've been asked by my grandmother, I've had to be able to break down what I learned at school, like the sort of like academic concepts into everyday language. And I never really thought of that as a skill or something that would come in good use later in life. And now here we are all these years later and hearing that this is something that sort of stands out, and this ability to take these sort of academic sort of ivory tower ideas and like be able to talk about them in everyday language with everyday people. And I think the reason for that really has to do with my particular upbringing.
You know, my story looks really different than yours, but I really resonate with this notion of being an academic that is really invested in being a different kind of academic than the ones that I had spent much of my schooling surrounded by. I'm also an academic that is very interested in writing in a way that invites people in to consider some really hard, complex, thorny, discomforting concepts, but to do it in a way in community. It's one thing if there's only 6 people talking. It's another thing if there's 60 people talking, right? These are the kinds of concepts that we want more people invited into. Your book, Conditional Citizens, is written, I'm sure, kind of over a spread of time. It's published a year ago. We are here celebrating its paperback publication, but the essays in it were stitched together from a wide variety of time periods. And yet it feels like you woke up early this morning and you wrote it just now. It's like you just finished the last page and we are here speaking about it. It is so incredibly timely, right? Tell us a little bit about that. I'm sure you've heard that comment before. How does that land on you as an author, right?
Well, I think it's interesting because I remember when the book before this one, when the novel, my last novel, The Other Americans, came out, I remember being asked by journalists, you know, your book is so timely because Trump had been elected. And I had to explain, I wrote it before he was elected. And I think the key to that is focusing on, not on what's happening in the news, but more on what's happening like around me in a sort of a timeless way, right? And in that book, I was interested in drawing a portrait of a community. And when you do that, and when you're interested in the characters as they are in real life, like I think a certain truth emerges from that, and that seems timely. So with this book, it was something that I really started working on, as you say, several years ago. I started writing a column for The Nation, and I was also writing essays for the New York Times Magazine, and they tended to be on sort of the same subjects, which is essentially belonging and exclusions, and the way in which communities basically decide, communities or nations decide who belongs in and who is excluded. And oftentimes that line is drawn over things that are accidents of birth. So for example, like your race or your gender or, you know, your national origins, or, you know, even your social class, which is also an accident of birth. All of these things that none of us have any control over end up deciding massively whether we belong or don't belong in a community, and as a consequence of that, what rights and protections we have access to. And so, but it wasn't until 2016 that I kind of hit on this idea of sort of conditionality in citizenship. Basically, that some citizens are equal citizens and some citizens are conditional citizens. They're Americans if, and then fill in the blank. So you're American if, you are, for example, you are proud of your country, or you believe it is the best country in the world, or you are silent about what it's doing overboard, or you support it in times of war. I mean, there's all these sort of conditions that are unspoken and that determine your status. And what's chilling about it is that if you happen to be of a particular race, you can flout some of those conditions and your belonging is not questioned. But then for other people, that belonging can be questioned. And so that's where the idea for the book, to kind of, do a book of essays around that topic. That's where the idea came from.
Conditionality is one of these ideas that we can apply in so many different ways, but as you're suggesting at the end of your comment, it's applied to different people for very different reasons, right? As a naturalized U.S. citizen, your citizenship is conditional upon celebrating the story of the nation.
Yes. Absolutely. And to be like, basically, if you're a naturalized citizen, you're expected to perform gratitude towards your host country, to say how it has given you a home. And yes, all those things are true, but it doesn't mean that you think that this country is perfect. You obviously want this country to be better. But if you do that, then you start hearing things like, well, go back to where you came from. And the issue is that this is, of course, it's deployed towards naturalized citizens, which, you hear all the time, but it's also deployed toward people who are natural born citizens. And we saw this in the case of, well, one of the most famous examples, of course, is when the former president told 4 progressive congresswomen to go back to where they came from. And why? Because these women, these members of Congress, duly elected, born in the US, except for one who is a refugee, but then the others were natural born citizens.
Yes.
Their grave crime was that they had policy disagreements with him, policy disagreements with the president. And that was enough for him to say, well, they should go where they came from. So there is that sense in which your belonging, if you're not a white person, there is a sense in which your belonging is conditional, and you are going to face these accusations of being unfaithful, and you're going to be told to go back and that you don't belong.
The example that you give with the congresswomen is, it feels so prescient and it feels really pressing. It can also feel really removed for some of us because, I'm just me. I'm not in such a public figure in that kind of a way. And yet that notion of performing our gratitude as people of color, as immigrants, as refugees, as somebody who's not, or whose conditionality is based on that acceptance of silence, that plays out in all of our lives, not just if you're a public figure, right? Yeah. And that's what I really appreciate about your writing. You're able to kind of go big, but you're also able to take ideas in some really personal and deep ways as well.
Yeah.
How does that performativity kind of play out in our communities?
Yeah.
How does it play out in our lives?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to necessarily come from the highest places. The reason that I use that example with the congresswomen, it's because it's an example that I can point to where everybody's going to know who it is you're talking about. Look, it's happening to these members of Congress. These are people that are in the news. You're going to hear about them. And so it's an easy way for people to understand what you mean by it. But absolutely, it is something that people confront in everyday, in small and in large ways. I mean, so many people have heard it. And I think that and so in the book, I describe it as being sort of embraced with one arm, but rejected with the other. And that sense of rejection, I think, can be particularly keen and loud and even violent in moments of like national stress. So for example, during the pandemic, you saw this directed at Asians and Asian Americans who were being accused of being bringers of disease or carriers of disease. And so you saw those incidents, those hate crimes and incidents of rejection happening in the news. You saw this, for example, after 9/11 with Muslims or people who were mistaken for Muslims, because that also happened to a number of people who were not Muslim at all. You know, the hate crimes, you know, Sikhs were also subjected to them. So, you know, after 9/11, you saw a spike in hate crimes against Muslims. You saw surveillance. You saw all kinds of things that were happening that were directed at that community. So in moments of national like stress, that the lines become sharper, and so you can see those, that manifestation becomes clear.
The lines become sharper and the bridges between us become even more elusive, right? That kind of living in the gray of knowing that I am me and you are you, and that gray is the part that actually can connect us toward one another, knowing that there is something of you in me and there's something of me in you. Absolutely. That seems like the first to go in these moments of national stress. Yeah. I think we can take some of those ideas around the nation and think about how those play out in families, how they play out in communities, how they play out within generations. We are replicating so many similar moves of harm and hurt that is, I think, really questioning our sense of belonging on some really deep, deep levels. I do a lot of consulting work, and I'm in and out of a lot of different organizations. And the level of hurt and woundedness that people are navigating, certainly COVID, police brutality, a range of things, but this is before last summer, the level of hurt and woundedness that so many of us are navigating is staggering. And in the midst of that, how do we inch our way towards belonging in our own hearts, with each other, with our colleagues, in our departments, in our offices, in our neighborhoods? It's something that I think a lot about, because when we're writing and talking about othering and disconnection, we're also, on the flip side, hoping for connection and belonging, right? Those are the kind of the two frames here. And in Conditional Citizens, you're speaking so much about that kind of state-sponsored othering that's happening in so many different ways to different communities. But there's also a pulse of what would it mean to belong? What would it mean to feel wanted and to know one is wanted? Say more about that, please.
Yeah, no, I was nodding along because, so there is a sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of a scale. So up to now, I've talked about like what I would say the sort of rhetoric. So you might say, oh, stop being so sensitive. These are microaggressions, right? So this minor feelings, right? Microaggressions. So it's verbal. It doesn't wound you. You're going to get over it. But in the book, I cover the sort of continuum, things like that, then escalating to individual acts of violence. So things like hate crimes. But I also go all the way toward state or state-sponsored actions. So there's a number of examples that I can give with that. So it's not just a question of telling people, for example, after 9/11, go back to where you came from. And it's not just a question of physical individual acts of violence, like, for example, as we saw after 9/11, where women's headscarves were torn from their faces, or where mosques were arsoned and things like that. But also incidents where the government interceded to essentially persecute a particular community. So one example I give, and this is in the opening chapter of the book, is a secret program that the New York Police Department rolled out in the years after 9/11, where there was a unit within NYPD called the demographics unit. Demographics, meaning that what it was doing, it was collecting data about a particular community. And so police officers basically infiltrated things like Muslim student unions at local colleges in the New York area. So places like Columbia and NYU and so on.
This is before 9/11, right?
No, this is after 9/11, although I can cite an example from before 9/11.
Oh, okay.
So they basically infiltrated student unions. They visited Muslim businesses. They gained access to private homes by posing, like, for example, one case, they basically knocked on somebody's door and said, "Oh, we're investigating a crime in the neighborhood. Can we come in and ask you questions to see if you've seen anything?" And people are, they can let them in thinking they're just helping, and maybe they're witnesses or they saw something. But the point wasn't to investigate a crime. That was a lie. It was to actually gain access inside the home and sort of look around and take notes and basically building profiles about everyone. And they did this for several years, and it was all secret. And it was revealed through an investigation by the Associated Press that ended up winning the Pulitzer, actually. And it was only after that scandal and everything was exposed that the program was halted. And at the time, Michael Bloomberg was the mayor of New York. And it wasn't until he was running for the Democratic nomination last year that he said that he kind of, but not really, was sorry for what had happened, all these years later. So that would be an example of where you see that the state is taking action. We're not just talking about people's feelings being hurt by rhetoric. We're not just talking about individuals taking it upon themselves to commit acts of violence, but we're talking about the government or the state basically taking actions against particular communities in the interest of security or in the interest of order and whatever. But in all of the time that all this surveillance was conducted, the New York Police Department did not come up with a single terrorism lead out of that. So that would be one example of what I mean by conditionality. And yeah, so.
And when these moments then become public, I mean, they're really interesting moments. As horrific as they are, they're really interesting moments because they are premised on silence and subterfuge. And when they come into the open, the sense of harm that communities feel feels so deep and generational. How do you repair things like this, right? These are, I think, some big questions for any of us that are grappling with issues of otherness and what it means to create more belonging in unequal and complex worlds like we're in right now. That kind of betrayal from the state isn't just about what happened right now. It links to a long chain of betrayals. Right? That's what we're seeing in so many of our organizing and our social justice movements, not just in the US, but around the world. People have long memories. The state might have really short memories, right? But people, communities have long-term memories. And I think that's one of the themes in Conditional Citizens that really rises to the top for me. When is it convenient to forget? When is it important to remember? Who's doing the memory making? Who's doing the meaning making? Who's trying to shift the meaning, pull it out from under us even before we know what's happening, right? Your chapters are speaking about this as well. Tell us a little bit about the role of memory.
No, I think that's really well observed. I think that the very act of kind of like writing a history, which is the act of committing memory to paper. So the very act of like writing history means choosing what you're going to write, right? You're choosing a particular set of events to remember, and you're choosing the order in which they're going to be narrated and what they're going to tell you about yourself. So in the story that America likes to tell about itself, so we have things like America is a nation of immigrants, right? This is the myth that we all hear about. It's a foundational idea, right? The Statue of Liberty, there's all these symbols around it, right? We're a diverse country, which we are. And so, all of that. So that's the story America likes to tell about itself. Where it gets into forgetting, in order to hold on to that idea, America then forgets certain parts of its history, which is that, in fact, it is not a nation of immigrants, because, or at least not until recently.
Right. It's not only a nation of immigrants, right?
Right.
That's
Story.
Right.
So first of all, when the pilgrims arrived, they did not find an empty country, right? There were people here before, there were indigenous people here before. And then a number of the people who arrived here did not arrive as immigrants, they arrived here as enslaved people. So that's number one. But then also the people who were allowed to set foot in the United States after its foundation tended to be from Europe. And the United States then went on to codify who could actually land in the US and claim citizenship. And for the majority of its history, up until 1965, that right was not extended to all races. It was absolutely tied to whiteness. In fact, you could not become a United States citizen unless you qualified as white. If you did not qualify as white, you did not have access to citizenship. And then on top of
we see a lot of legal challenges to this, right, in the early 20th century.
Lots of challenges, because, if you were an immigrant from a country and you were not white, then you had to go in front of a court and you had to say, I am white because, and then you had to prove why. And then the judges could decide whether you were a citizen or not. So that's for people who were who wanted to apply for citizenship. But even for the right to even set foot in the US, to even immigrate to the US, that was also related to race, because there were a slew of laws that limited who could immigrate to the US. So you have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which basically barred Chinese laborers from entering, or any Chinese from entering the US. Then you have the Johnson-Reed Act, which is Asian exclusion more broadly. You have the 1924 Immigration Act, which basically not only barred Asians, but also said that only immigrants from certain parts of Europe would be able to come in. And the way that they did that was through the use of quotas based on an older census. So basically throughout the history of the United States, immigration was severely limited. Those limitations were based on race. Citizenship was exclusive to whiteness, was linked to whiteness, and therefore it was available only to white people. And it really was only until 1965 that immigration and citizenship were decoupled from race. So after that point, you can start talking about a nation of immigrants, but not before that. So the nation of immigration idea depends on the erasure of that history, which just in a pure number of years is a much longer history than from 1965 to now. And now we are in a new period, we're entering a new period where we have new restrictions on immigration that were put in place by the Trump administration and upheld by the Supreme Court. And so, so we're entering a new era of restrictions. And again, those restrictions are mostly for Black and brown people. So this is what I mean by how, memory and national memory, which is history, is very much based on erasure. It's based on forgetfulness. And I give a couple of other examples like that in the book.
And that the consequences of that erasure are not just about right then, but there is something so deeply undignified to not remember where we are standing upon, whose shoulders we have come up through, right? That kind of ancestral knowledge can be really empowering in some way, but also the histories of exclusion, when we have so little space to share and understand that, what does it do to our sense of nation, right? It skews it. It makes it, where we have a lot of conversation about equal playing field, but even the knowledge that we have about the nation, there's nothing equal about it.
Right. And I think that it's because that history is erased, or it's not discussed in sort of like this healthy or open ways. And instead there is this sort of like clinging to these myths, these foundational myths. It's precisely because of that today we have situations like what we see in Virginia with all that debate over what to teach in schools. Like there's and now it's basically this moral panic is basically sweeping the country about what oh my God, what are we teaching the children? And it really is a question about what kind of history we're teaching them. Are we teaching them some sort of fairy tale version of history, or are we teaching them history that we all know happened? And it really comes across to me as this desire to cling to these ideas of a great and benevolent nation, which is a light unto others, and to cling to that rather than to history as it happened. That's what I think the debate comes down to.
I want to bring into this conversation just some of the titles of your chapters for folks who haven't read Conditional Citizens yet. Just so as you are hearing Laila speak about some of these broader national erasures of history, here's how she weaves these themes into the book: allegiance, faith, borders, assimilation, tribe, caste, inheritance. And I love the simplicity of these titles, because there's nothing simple about any of those terms, right? They're very multivalent, very nuanced terms. And the stories that you are sharing in each of these chapters helps weave those very complex themes throughout it, not only in your own life and part of your immigration story, your becoming a conditional citizen, your refutation of being a conditional citizen, your questioning of it, but also as it plays out with so many other communities, not just Arabs and Muslims. Right? I think that's a really important point I want to give you an opportunity to speak about. This book isn't only about Arabs and Muslims, it is, and it also is about all of us. Say more on that, please.
Yeah, this is something that I went back and forth on a lot. Every time that I considered my experience in the United States, that led me to the experiences of people who were similar to me. So, other Arabs or other Muslims or, other women and other immigrants, right? So those were kind of the obvious sort of categories that came to mind. But as I began to then expand it into that, it was impossible for me to do that without thinking about other people that had gone through the same experiences some years earlier or concurrently. So to give you an example, when I started thinking about the treatment of Arabs and Muslims in this country following 9/11, it was impossible to discuss things like surveillance and accusations of being traitors and saboteurs and all that. It was impossible to discuss that without some kind of reference to the experience of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Yes. And in fact, one of the anecdotes I tell in the book is that the very place in which I was sworn in as a citizen, which this was in the year 2000, I became a citizen in July 2000, and I so basically they gather all the way swearing-in ceremonies take place is that they gather a bunch of people and they do them in batches, right? So in my batch, it was like several thousand people. It was like 2,000 or 3,000 new citizens, and they put us in this huge hangar at the Pomona Fairplex, which in Los Angeles, which is where traditionally the county fair takes place every summer. So it's a place that in all of our minds has very positive associations, because it's the place where you eat churros and the kids are petting goats and people are going on rides. So it's a place of like family enjoyment. So then we went there, and that's where I was sworn in. It was in this hangar. And then so some years later, I was trying to find out how large the Pomona Fairplex was, because I was writing about that ceremony, and it's 437 acres. But while I was looking up the Pomona Fairplex, that's how I came across its history as an assembly center during World War II. And apparently, during the Second World War, when Japanese internment began all over the West Coast, like the places where county fairs took place were also used as assembly centers. So this was where the places where Japanese Japanese Americans were told to report with their families so that they could then be interned. So everybody had to show up there. They were issued their numbers, they were processed, they were put on trains, and they were taken away to internment camps. And the people who were assembled at Pomona Fairplex, and basically these are people who came from surrounding counties, LA County and surrounding counties, they were shipped off to Wyoming, to a concentration camp in Wyoming. And it blew my mind. It just blew my mind that, here we are, decades later, that the government thought nothing of using those same places to swear in new generations of Americans, new Americans. And it also struck me as a powerful metaphor, because what it meant was that the government basically had erased the past. Like, there was no, at the time that I was sworn in, there was no marker that this had served as an assembly center. There was no trace of that history. It was just like basically sort of like, given this dream, like basically everybody was a dreamer, if you will, and we were inducted into this dream without actually seeing the reality that was underneath it. And so, when I was working on my own citizenship ceremony, writing about it, I thought it was incredible. And that's when I really became convinced that it was impossible for me to write the story and make it exclusively about Arabs and Muslims. If it was going to be about citizenship, it had to basically connect our experiences to the experiences of other communities who were similarly excluded at different times in the history of the United States. And what's incredible is that oftentimes we talk about Japanese internment as something that has happened in the past, and Asian Americans are talked about as sort of like the model minority. They're the people who have succeeded culturally and economically. We often hear these figures about their economic success and so on and so forth. And yet the pandemic happens, and then you start to see how quickly that turns. It doesn't matter that you're the model minority. Grandmothers are getting assaulted on the street. So where's that model minority? Where how far does that take you? And so,
the nation is a repository for that anxiety, right? And you can cover it up by hosting a new ceremony on top of it. But that repository for anxiety does get played out over and over and over again. Right? I want to thank everyone for joining in and for asking some really thoughtful questions for Laila. I'm going to combine two of our questions here that we have from our participants. One person is asking about, when did you start writing Conditional Citizens? And can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing it? And I'd like you to actually connect it with another question that someone's asking you, right? When you were talking about the demographics department post 9/11, it makes me think about prevention versus exposure. Is there a way to prevent this hatred and bigotry rather than exposing it after the fact? Do you see a path forward to changing the way we value others? Or does the US just skip from hating one group to another? I'm feeling like your writing process is very much connected to this other question too. Please tell us.
All right, I'm going to try and answer these. So the sort of the technical time in which I wrote this book, I had the idea during the Democratic National Convention in 2016. I'm sure some of you remember, there was this couple from Virginia that showed up on stage, and they were basically talking about citizenship and rights, but their son was a veteran. I mean, not a veteran, he was actually an active duty soldier who died in the line of duty. And so they were talking about their son, and then the father whipped out that copy of the Constitution. And all. So it was a very dramatic moment. But it struck me that the way in which the couple was treated in the press in the week after their appearance at the convention, because on the one hand, they were embraced as like this wonderful couple whose son has made the ultimate sacrifice for his country, and just basically treated as like these just wonderful people, gold star parents, so on and so forth. But then also the other side of that was that the father was accused of being a stooge for the Muslim Brotherhood, of having secret and nefarious connections, and the son even was treated as some kind of stealth jihadist. And so that sort of embrace and rejection at the same time really struck me, and I wrote a piece about it, and it was called Conditional Citizens. And that's kind of what got me thinking it's time to, you know, basically put all of these ideas that have been percolating in my head about immigration and citizenship and belonging into one book. And so that's when it started. And then it was supposed to come out in March 2020. Then the pandemic happened, and then it was pushed to September 2020. And then now here we are for the paperback in, what is it, November 2021. So it's been a long, a long process. And as far as the process of writing it, even though it began in 2016, it was sort of in short spurts when I was taking breaks from this other book that I was writing, and then pretty much full time in 2018 and 19. So it's, you know, something that I worked on more as time passed, and I was done with the other book, so I had time to focus on this one. So that's as far as kind of like the time of writing it. And then as far as the writing process, it was, for me, it was basically a chance to kind of delve into history, which is something that I really enjoy doing. I enjoy doing research, and I enjoy combining that with narrative. So from that perspective, I really enjoyed that part. And it's so different from writing fiction. It's so different because in writing fiction, I sort of inhabit or try to inhabit the character and withhold judgment. But with nonfiction, there's no character, there's just me narrating what's happening. And so there's a lot more judgment, a lot more opinions filtering into the writing. So they're
character in a different way.
Yeah, they're just very different. And then as far as the second question, which was about you know, whether we can move beyond sort of exposing these things in order to prevent them, I think, or we can prevent them from happening. I wish that exposing could prevent, but it's going to take a lot more exposing and on a very consistent basis in order to prevent. So I'm going to give you an example of that. That's just from the very recent past. As the United States was withdrawing out of Afghanistan, there was, I'm sure you heard about this incident where an Afghan aid worker and his family were killed in a US strike. And it was just kind of the circumstances and the reasons for that just weren't very clear. And, you know, basically the United States had said that he was, you know, some kind of a terrorist or some kind of, you know, that there was a justification for that strike. And of course, you know, the family came out and said, no, he was an aid worker. Here's where he was. He had nothing to do with what was going on. He was actually helping people to evacuate. And so there was a bit of, you know, back and forth. And so the US was, okay, we're going to investigate. So they investigated. They said, well, oops, sorry. You know, yes, he was an aid worker. And yes, you know, however many members of his family basically died for nothing, but nobody was punished. And we did not break any rules by doing that. So, you know, sometimes exposing and preventing don't necessarily go hand in hand. You know, it's sometimes exposing is, you know, is useful for us who are students of history, so we know what happened, but it doesn't necessarily prevent things. Maybe if it does prevent them, then we don't see them because they've been prevented, but then we don't see those things because they've been prevented. But yeah, I think it's important to continue exposing, and hopefully it means that we are preventing further disasters. I mean, certainly the exposure of what happened after 9/11, I feel like has made people very, very alert, so that when the pandemic started and we started to see some of that being some of what Asian Americans were going through, there were enough people around to say, wait a minute, we remember what was going on because this wasn't that long ago, and we remember it very well. So I think that from that perspective, then yes, maybe it prevented a reaction that could have been even worse if enough time had passed between them and people had forgotten. But it's just 9/11 wasn't that long ago, and so I think maybe that might have helped keep us more alert, I will say. If not preventing, at least it makes us more alert to it.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of exposure on a couple different levels, right? Exposure to a particular history that wasn't so long ago and resurrecting that when we need to as collective action, right? That's part of what I hear you saying. There's also, I think, as somebody who teaches literature, there's the hope that literature can help us be a bridge to one another. We can create the bridge as we're walking it, as we're reading it, so to speak, right? Reading about people who are not you and inhabiting lives that are somewhat you, but also not you, and stretching our comfort with some of that. There's got to be some hope in that, right?
Yeah.
This gets to a couple of the prompts and questions that some of our audience is asking. In the last chapter of Conditional Citizens, you talk about not despairing about this country and describe what equal citizenship looks like. Do you see us moving forward toward equal citizenship? In other words, where do you find hope? And I want to just also bring in another comment. Someone who's an international student in the US, I hope to have a sense of belonging here, but I don't know a lot of the culture about the US. Sometimes I'm not so sure what folks are saying. Can you give any suggestions for us to stay? So in those two questions, like we're talking about something very large and we're also talking about one particular person.
Yeah.
Both are speaking about hope. Both are speaking about how do you feel a sense of righteousness in your belonging, right? Being right in your belonging and feeling righteous about the belonging, right? Because it's not given, it's fought for, it's hard won.
Yeah. I think so. My answer to that has to do with sort of taking the long view. When I think about the person who wrote do not despair of this country, which is Frederick Douglass, basically this was a person who was enslaved and eventually, escaped and became, this sought after speaker and had this incredible life. And I just feel that if previous generations had given up hope, then we wouldn't be here today. And so our existence is very much dependent on hope and on the previous generations sort of refusing to say, oh my God, it's so hopeless. If everything was hopeless, then we would never have gotten rid of slavery, right? So and so we wouldn't be here without the ancestors. And so we have to put hope into action. And that's when you do that, then you feel hope because you've done something to sort of move the needle forward. So
history that often gets buried.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That kind of hope history is our action.
Yeah, like Seamus Haney, right, says that hope and history rhyme. Once in a generation, hope and history rhyme. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have that in the book, because when you talk about this history, it's very easy to sort of become very cynical, but you can't, because I do believe in progress. Absolutely, a life like mine would not be possible, say 100 years ago. 100 years ago, my life would have been very different. And so I think that it's important to have hope through action. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have that chapter at the end to sort of outline, well, if you talk about conditional citizenship, what might equal citizenship look like? There's something to kind of continue working toward, which I think can be done, as I said, through collective action and even personal action, but collective action, of course. And with the second question for this person who's asking about like not understanding sort of everything that's going on in the culture. Well, since we are speaking at a university bookstore, I feel compelled to say that there are extension classes at universities usually. And so I really do encourage you to take history classes and to learn more about this history. And I think that that will give you a sense a bit about sort of the context of this country, the wider context of this country, and some of these ideas that we're talking about. And that might make it easier for you to decide where you want to stay.
Because even if we are recently placed into the story, we too are part of the story then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And it's what I found fascinating is how often these communities that are portrayed as being sort of like recent arrivals are actually not recent arrivals. So for example, when you think about Muslims, right? So oftentimes you hear politicians talking about this Judeo-Christian nation. And the reality is that Muslims have been part of United States history since before the founding of the nation. And so, but knowing about that history does require actually, sort of, engaging with it and studying it and learning more about it.
Yes. I think we have time for one more cluster of some ideas that our participants are offering. Let's see, one second. Do you have thoughts on how our changing US demographics will affect belonging in the next generation? Knowing people of color are not a monolith, is there enough of a shared identity and experience between Americans of color to shift the tide of our national identity?
I mean, this is a really good question, right? I think that we have demographically, I believe this is the year where 50% of isn't it 50% of the babies born in the US now it's like half are white and half are non-white. So the trend is going toward whites themselves becoming one of many communities that are kind of, there's not one majority group, right? And I think what's interesting, particularly in your question, is this idea that there is not a monolith. And you can kind of see that a little bit in the last election cycle when we see some of the voting patterns of different communities of color. And it's obviously, it's not as if, it's not as if one candidate is drawing, all the white vote or all the black vote or all the Asian votes. What you're seeing is like these different coalitions. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next generation in terms of where we're going. My fear right now is about the most basic right of citizenship, which is the right to vote. Yes. How that right is increasingly being made very difficult to exercise, particularly for people who are not white. Yes. Excuse me. And how some of these voting rights laws that are being passed and, across the nation, they're essentially locking in, they're making it very difficult to have a true representative government. So already we have this problem with the Senate, right? Where the state of Wyoming has something like 500,000, where's 500,000 people, and you have people in California have 40 million people, and basically they have the same numbers of senators, right? So we don't really have like a direct democracy, and that problem, which maybe in the past, it was something that maybe you could cobble together some kind of a functioning government out of that. And I think that now it's going to become increasingly difficult. And then you factor in climate change and you factor in everything else. But I think it'll be interesting to see where we're going to go once we hit sort of the next generation, right? And we see that demographics have shifted completely. I really don't know how to hazard a guess because so much depends on, like I said, climate change and where people are going to move. So to give you an example, during the pandemic, we saw people moving from one state to the next. So, who's to say how climate is not going to affect demographic shifts like that, within the country. And that could also have an effect on national identity. You know,
That's a very provocative question.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a rich question. It's impossible to think about it. Like, you know, yes, you know, the country is going to have a different sort of national identity in terms of race and the race mixing, but is it going to have a different identity politically? Like, are we going to sort of move out of this, you know, just as we decoupled whiteness from the citizenship, is it possible to decouple whiteness out of politics? Like, that's the thing that's the question. I don't like to hazard the guess, but I think the question itself is really interesting to ponder. So you've given me something to think about.
And let's wrap up our conversation with a very different kind of question from one of our attendees. What's the book that's on your nightstand? What are you reading or listening to? And they're asking both you and I to share what is near us. What are you reading?
I'm reading a new novel, the latest novel by Sigrid Nunez, which is called "What Are You Going Through?" I'm a big fan of hers, and this book is sort of, you know, is about a woman who she basically, it's basically just her life. She goes from meeting different people and she talks about these different meetings and her connections to these different people and their histories. And it's like I can get lost in Sigrid Nunez's words, you know, just like when she starts talking, I kind of get lost in the narrative. It's so beautifully written. But, you know, it took me a while to get back to reading. This is, you know, when the pandemic started, I had a really hard time to focus. So I spent several months really not reading, and it was just terrible. And it's only in 2021, so this year, that I really went back to reading. I also just before that novel, I read a collection of essays called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. And that one I enjoyed quite a bit too. Let me see what else. Oh, I have it right here. I keep a little reading journal. So, yeah. And before that, I read Outline by Rachel Cusk. And before that, which is very good. Before that, I read a children's Bible by Lydia Millett, and so on and so forth. So,
what are you working on now?
I'm working on a new novel about which I'm not going to give any details, but it is. But yes, I just, you know, like I said, you know, during the pandemic, I was just during the pandemic, we're still in the pandemic, but during the first year of the pandemic, everything was upside down. My book was delayed. Nobody knew if there would be a vaccine. I couldn't read, and I certainly couldn't write. Like, more power to the people who wrote books. There are some people who wrote books during those early months. I couldn't function. But so this year I decided enough is enough, and I went back to work. And so then the reading came back, and then I started working on a new novel. So
I love the mix of genres in your writing repertoire. It's very enticing to follow an author that is kind of comfortable with the discomfort of having many different kinds of genres under your belt. And so I appreciate that about you a lot. What a delightful conversation with you today. Thank you so much, Laila, for your wisdom, for your work. And thanks everyone for joining us today and all the great questions and prompts that you've offered. This really needs like a 6-hour conversation with how juicy your book is, and the participation of people and your prompts. So thanks everyone for the abbreviated version of this today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better. We could have listened to you both discuss this all night. So thank you both for a really powerful and illuminating discussion centered around the book Conditional Citizens. And thank you to our audience for your very thoughtful and insightful questions. We could have kept going with that. So really thank you all for your participation and just being so involved in this very important topic. You may purchase copies of Laila Lalami's Conditional Citizens, as well as Anu Taranath's Beyond Guilt Trips at University Bookstore using the links in the chat. So on behalf of University Bookstore, I want to thank Laila and Anu for stopping by and having this discussion here with us. And thank you to our audience for spending an hour with us and a good book. See you all at our next author event. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.